So looking at some just Pew Research Center data, we see some pretty wide divides between public opinions on certain scientific topics and what the scientific community at large kind of thinks about those topics. This is pretty intuitive if you just take any of your favorite hot button topics, like say, for example, whether or not it's safe to eat genetically modified foods. There's a pretty big difference between what the population at large and what the scientific community thinks about that issue. So not speaking to the validity or any particular direction on any of these topics, it's just good to note that there is that sort of divide. And that has some really interesting consequences. And I think this is really pressing given just the current state of affairs in our country, for example. While the general outlook and the general view of the scientific community and the view of science in the United States is generally pretty positive. A little less positive than in other countries, but still generally pretty positive. In the last 10 years or so, there has been kind of a swing towards a negative view of science and its impacts on healthcare and food and the environment and other aspects of civilization. And of course, that then has the effect of decreasing whether or not the public at large, whether or not taxpayers want to fund science. And so, I as a researcher really heavily rely on public funds to do my research. And so if the citizenry is beginning to view science in a negative light, then of course the desire to want to fund science is also going to decrease. I think that has negative consequences, but that's not what we're here to talk about exactly. So a kind of a very basic gut instinct reaction to that knowledge, I think, is to assume that the reason for those trends are because the public at large just doesn't know about science. And so that actually is it's not even funny, but that is the majority opinion of the scientific community, or at least of the American Academy of the Association of Sciences, is that the public just doesn't know much about science, and that leads to these problems. That's very reminiscent of a model of education, of science education, known as the knowledge deficit model, wherein scientific facts and realities are given to the public, and that increases public understanding and perception of reality. What's interesting is that science shows us that that's just not the case, that this knowledge deficit model is bunk. You can see across all different sorts of socioeconomic contexts, differences in religious or political ideology, different economic worldviews, differences in trends of acceptance and belief in certain kinds of science. So everyone's favorite example, climate change, and the perceived risk of climate change. Among egalitarian, communitarian typed folks, there's a positive correlation with scientific literacy and numeracy and perceived risk, and a negative correlation among hierarchical individualists. If you want to know more about that, you can check out Kahan's study. And probably my favorite graph of all time, you see that exact same kind of trend among traditional liberal Democrats and traditional conservative Republicans, again about scientific literacy and numeracy and perceived risk of climate change. So this is just to highlight, because we're not talking about climate change today, but this is just to highlight that idea that if the public just had the knowledge that public understanding and perception of reality would increase is just not the case. There's a lot more going on there. So what is going on there? If that model's broken, if that model doesn't work, what if we just engage the public more? So we have this public engagement with science model, where you've got your sort of like Bill Nye the Science Guy types, or science museums, where there's a little bit more hands-on activity going on. If there's a little bit more proximity with the scientists, is there more acceptance of the data? And unfortunately, there's a lot of mixed evidence as to whether or not that is actually effective, if that's an effective model or not, for lots of reasons that we're not necessarily going to get into today. But what does work, what we're beginning to see does work, is this science communication model, wherein we take account of the public's socio-political context, economic status, those sorts of things, and in particular, we take into account these mediated realities, whereby scientific facts and realities are perceived. This is really important in beginning to be really important in cognitive and social psychology. It spans everything from cognitive biases as to how we actually perceive and process information, all the way to what avenue of information you receive your scientific information from, whether it's the news or television and so on. And so all the research related to that. So that kind of brings me to Dr. Subramanian, who is a faculty and researcher here at UNO in the School of Communication. And she's going to talk to us a little bit about one of those kind of mediated realities related to stigma and mental health. And so before I get into that, I kind of want to just lay out the structure of the next couple of hours. After her presentation, we're going to have a few minutes of Q&A directly for Dr. Subramanian. If you want to talk to her about her research, please ask her questions. And then we would like to, what is the ultimate goal of CST, is to facilitate a community dialogue. So we're going to open it to the floor. There's just a couple of ground rules that we do have for that discussion. Try to refrain from any abject political polarization. Just refrain from that if possible. Also, please try not to use the room as a soapbox. If you begin to run down the time, we do have some moderators with some guided discussion points to kind of keep the conversation going. And finally, just be respectful of other people's voices. A couple last things. There is a contact sheet that is going to be floating around here somewhere. If you're interested in what we're doing here and want to get involved, if you want access to some of the resources that we have in terms of research and literature, or if you just want a monthly update newsletter as to what we're doing, please feel free to sign that. We'd love to get in contact with you. We'd love you to get involved. And lastly, we have the National Alliance of Mental Illness chapter here in Omaha. They have set up a table in the back there with some resources as to mental health care in Omaha. And so if you're interested in any of that, please feel free to talk to them and grab that afterwards. So before I talk away the night, I'm going to help me welcome up Dr. Subramanian.
Good evening, can you hear me? Okay, great. Thank you all for being here. It's really nice to see such a large crowd. And I also want to thank the CST community and Sean for just inviting me and giving me a chance to talk about my research. So, as the title slide kind of indicates, I'd like today to talk about a study that has to do with how visual narratives in particular can be used to combat stigma. And I'd like to start by just saying a little bit about why it's important to study stigma. So, stigma has been characterized as a social determinant of health. So a social determinant of health is different from an individual determinant of health, which you might think of as genetics. So a social determinant of health refers to social conditions that lead to poor health outcomes. So things like maybe growing up in a violent neighborhood, or being unemployed, or being socially isolated. So all of these social conditions which can cause negative health effects. Stigma is considered a fundamental cause of population health inequality because it is involved in so many different diseases. So we're not just talking about mental disorders or mental illness, we're also talking about physical disorders. And so that's what multiple disease outcomes kind of refers to. And stigma also leads to poor health outcomes through a number of different mechanisms. So it leads to psychological issues, behavioral problems, it causes social isolation, which we know leads to poor health. So for all of these different reasons, stigma is considered to be a social determinant of health. For those of you who are public health geeks, Hatzimpula et al. Explains really beautifully why stigma is a social determinant of health. I had one of those exciting moments, like, when you have an ice cream and you're really excited. That's how I felt after I read the article. So I would encourage you to read the article. It's written in a very, very engaging manner, and it's really thought-provoking. I want to talk a little bit about my research program, just to kind of situate this study. So, as Sean said, I'm a professor in the School of Communication. And so my PhD is in journalism. I kind of have an interdisciplinary background. I started off as a biology student, and then decided I also really like the humanities, and so now I have a background in both the sciences and the humanities. So for all of you who are thinking about switching your major, you can do it. Yeah. So anyway, so my research now focuses on health communication. That's my overall kind of large research umbrella. Within health, I also do a little bit of science communication. That's how I got kind of connected to CST. And then within health comm, I would say a major area of my interest is stigma communication. And so within stigma comm, I look at three basic questions in all of my studies. So one is, because my background is in journalism, and because I'm interested in communications, I'm particularly interested in how stigmatized disorders, for example, mental illness, are portrayed by the media. And I'm interested in mediated portrayals of stigmatized disorders because, as Sean said, the media influence people's beliefs, people's attitudes, people's behaviors. We also know that the media can influence policy decisions, so it's important to understand how these stigmatized disorders are actually framed by the media. I'm also interested in what happens to the consumer of that information. So when an audience member is reading a story about mental illness, how does that story affect them? And the study I'll talk about today kind of ties into question 2. And then also I'm interested in, given that stigma causes all of these problems, it leads to poor health outcomes, it's a fundamental cause of population health inequality, what do we do about the problem? So how do you strategically design messages to combat stigma? That's just one of my friends. It's funny when you have friends who understand your research program better than you do. And so it's when you have friends like that, and if they are artistically inclined, ask them to draw a Venn diagram of your research program, because that's what this friend did for me, and it was another amazing moment because I was like, yes, that's everything that I do. So the overall research area is health comm, and then I tend to look at within stigma, I tend to focus specifically on stigmatized health disorders. So today, the study I'm talking about is going to focus on mental illness, and I would say that most of my studies on stigma so far have looked at mental illness, but I look at stigma in other disease contexts too. So whether it's obesity, chronic pain, infectious diseases like Ebola. I also look at mediated representations of stigma in a variety of different media. So I look at news stories about, say, mental illness, but I'm also looking at public service announcements, commercial ads, and the study I'm talking about today has to do with comics. So we'll get to that soon. I also look at different types of audiences. So I look at definitely the producers of the messages, so journalists, for example, but then consumers, so maybe news consumers, but also patients, how the patients consume health information. I know I've used the word stigma quite a bit, and it is a word that is kind of part of our everyday language. This is also a pretty complicated concept though, and so I thought I would break down some of the different ways in which researchers understand stigma. So a very basic definition, and if you read any paper on stigma, you cannot but help to cite Kaufman, with his seminal work from 1963, where he laid out a very basic definition of stigma, which is stigma is an attribute or a characteristic that discredits a person. Moving on from there, another mind-blowing paper is one written by sociologists Bruce Link and Joe Phelan, and so they talked about stigma as a process, and so this diagram kind of explains the stigmatization process. So in very simple terms, stigma starts with, the stigmatization process starts with labeling. So labeling means you identify a human, identify a particular difference and you label it, so that the human difference is something that society thinks is important, so whether it's IQ or gender or race. So you identify that as differences among the population and then you assign a label to it. In the next step, stereotyping, you associate that label with the negative attributes or characteristics. So for example, the context of mental illness, if you think of the label mentally ill, that label is often associated with people being violent or dangerous, so that's a stereotype. Stereotyping leads to separation, which means that when you have this particular label and now you've associated people who have this label with a negative characteristic, you begin to think that they are fundamentally different from us, so then there's this separation between you and them. And that consequently leads to the stigmatized individual or individuals experiencing a loss of status and then facing discrimination, individual discrimination, or structural discrimination. So structural discrimination is, say, maybe which is not, interpersonal, but policies which lead to people being discriminated. And so discrimination can also, labeling can also be a form of discrimination, and so again, the cycle continues. Something which is really important which I find really interesting about this particular diagram and this process is that for stigmatization to occur, there has to be a power differential. There has to be social, economic, and political power between the person who is stigmatizing and the person who is stigmatized. So it's important to remember that, and that's kind of at the heart of this particular cycle. There are also different dimensions of stigma. So stigma dimensions are a way to distinguish the one stigmatized disorder from the other, because as I said earlier, stigma is a part of so many different health disorders, not just physical but also mental, and so these dimensions are a way to look for differences between disorders. So for example, concealability is whether the stigmatized condition that you have, can it be seen or can it not be seen? And whether your disorder can be concealed or not will influence how other people treat you, will influence how you get access to treatment. Course refers to what is the course of the disorder, so can it be reversed? So you have certain disorders which can't really be reversed and others which can. You have disruptiveness, and that is about to what extent does the stigmatized disorder interfere with your everyday life? So is it something which is there, which is noticeable, but it doesn't really disrupt your life, or something which causes a lot of disruption? Aesthetics refers to, as kind of the term indicates, it refers to does the stigmatized disorder elicit a reaction of disgust? So does the disorder result in certain types of symptoms or characteristics that elicits disgust from the audience or the perceiver? Origin is really important. Origin is connected to this dimension of controllability. So if an individual has a stigmatized disorder and it's perceived that they brought the disorder upon themselves, that they are responsible for the disorder, they are more likely to be blamed or get negative responses. If you think of disorders like lung cancer or obesity, which are highly stigmatized, versus say breast cancer, which maybe has less of controllability, that can influence how other people treat you. And then peril refers to whether the disorder has symptoms that are dangerous, that cause people to be afraid. And yet another way to look at stigma is to look at the different types of stigma. I have to say, when I first started studying stigma, I think I discovered stigma as a master's student while doing my thesis. My master's thesis was about how journalists in the United States cover mental illness, and I stumbled upon this concept of stigma, and for a long time my definition of stigma was just the Irving Kaufman definition, which I showed you a couple of slides ago, and now I realize there will be new definitions emerging for the rest of my life, which is great because I love the concept, but it's a very complicated concept. You have different types of stigma. So you have public stigma. This is the type of stigma that I'm talking about in my study today. So public stigma is stigmatizing reactions that are elicited in general by people with a stigmatized disorder. Self-stigma is stigma that if you have a stigmatized disorder, the negative feelings that you feel towards yourselves because you recognize that you have this disorder. Stigma by association is really interesting. It's also called courtesy stigma. So it's the stigma that you experience if you spend time with someone else who has a particular stigmatized disorder. So that's why it's stigma by association. And the structural stigma is what I alluded to earlier. So stigma which is perpetuated by society's institutions. So whether they are governmental policies, the news media is another institution. So if journalists write stories about mental illness which propagate stigma, then the press as an institution is also propagating structural stigma. And then, because I'm a communication researcher, this particular kind of explication of stigma is possibly my favorite because it explains what a stigma message is. So if you look at the far left and it says message choices, so according to Smith, who proposed this particular model, a stigma message has certain cues, has certain content cues, which indicates that these stigmatized individuals are different, that that they are responsible for their condition, that they are dangerous, and then those message cues elicit cognitive and emotional reactions, which in turn elicit stigmatizing behavioral intentions and behaviors. And this is the model which was which I used for the study that I'll talk about in a minute. So I've talked a lot about stigma and all the problems that it causes. And so as someone who's interested in strategic communication and as someone who's interested in solutions, what do we do? How do we create messages that combat stigma? So based on Smith's model, you can kind of hypothesize that by corollary, an anti-stigma message, instead of distinguishing the individual and isolating the individual, will instead increase identification between the person who is reading a story, say about someone who has a stigmatized disorder, and that individual himself or herself. When I talked about stigma dimensions, I talked about origin or controllability. So stigmatizing messages typically blame the individual for their disorder, and so an anti-stigma message would kind of indicate that the origin of the disorder or the cause or the solution is not with the individual but in the social context in which the individual resides. And then instead of encouraging people to share a stigma message, an anti-stigma message would encourage people to participate in efforts to eliminate the stigma. And so one type of message that has been studied quite a bit and which has an anti-stigma mechanism is a narrative. So narrative, again, is a term that we use in everyday life. In very simple terms, a narrative is a story. And so if you want to look at a formal definition of a narrative is a story that has a beginning, middle, and end. It has characters, it has scenes. There is typically a problem which reaches a climax, and then there is a solution, so there is a narrative arc. So this is one of one way to define a narrative. And so if you look at the literature, there is a really interesting body of literature on narrative persuasion. And if you look at that literature and you look at it particularly in the context of narratives and mental illness and stigma, you see that whatever type of format narrative messages are in, whether it's a news story or whether it's advertising, it's been found that when you expose people to a narrative, a message in a narrative format, they are more likely to be compassionate towards the individuals in the story. They are less likely to stigmatize them. The last point talks about social distancing behavior. Social distance is one way in which you operationalize the concept of public stigma. So it's one way in which you measure public stigma. So if you look at a social distance scale, it will ask you questions like, would you be willing to sit next to a person with with a stigmatized disorder like mental illness, would you be willing to have lunch with them? Would you be willing to go out with them? Would you? So the levels of social distance get smaller and smaller, and so the scale is supposed to kind of aim for your level of a stigmatizing response, right? Anyway, so we found that narratives, whether they are in the form of news stories, whether they are in the form of advertising, in all their different formats, when you expose subjects to a narrative, news story about stigmatized disorder, it tends to reduce their stigmatizing response. So about a year or so ago, when I was still trying to survive in my PhD program, I was getting closer and closer to the point where you have to go to your advisor and basically propose an idea. And I had kind of been obsessed with narratives and stigma and wanting to come up with some kind of anti-stigma strategy. And then, people often tell you to kind of, not to study for like 16 hours straight, like take a break. And that's good advice because I took a break and read a comic book and I got an idea for my dissertation. So I must say that I'm trying to remember how exactly I stumbled upon comics. I don't know. The culture I come from, comics are not seen as really, they're seen as children's literature, they're not seen as literature that you read when you become an adult. So the last time I think I still read the funnies in the newspaper, but the last time I actually read an Archie comic, so I was like, 7 or 10 years old. I hadn't read comics since then. But because I happened to find this particular book, which was, so comics also, they're called graphic novels, and then comics or graphic novels, particularly about health, fall into this genre called graphic medicine. And so Mom's Cancer is, it's an Eisner Award-winning graphic novel. The Eisners are kind of the Oscars of the graphic novel world. And so it's a non-fiction comic, and it's written by Brian Feiss, and it's about his mother's experiences with cancer. The term comic, I think sometimes we think about comics as predominantly funny literature or funny stories, and there is an element of humor to these books, but I would say that I would characterize them as being really poignant and moving, and yes, they are funny, but they are mainly thought-provoking, and really they deal with really serious issues, but in an illustrative format. So I read Mom's Cancer by Brian Feiss and just was so completely taken by the way the author talks about certain experiences that patients have while moving through the healthcare industry, and how illustrations kind of made those experiences come alive. And so I wanted to put up this slide just to say that if you are in health communication, if you are a health communication researcher, the use of cartoons or comics in health communication is not new. As someone who comes from a country where there are multiple languages, cartoons, diagrams, images are often a way to communicate health information. So, whether it's like how to wash your hands or how to take your medicine, we are very, very familiar with messages in comics format. In fact, for those of you who are into journalism, there is now long-form narrative journalism in comics format. Again, this is not fiction, this is non-fiction, this is reported, very well researched, and again, the stories talk about very serious issues. So the comics journalism is an emerging genre, but you can see it sometimes in the New York Times, you can see it in other types of publications. And so before telling you maybe a little bit more about comics, the little girl with the big eyes, she is, there's a really beautiful graphic novel called Marbles, and Marbles is written by an author called Ellen Forney, and Marbles is about Ellen Forney's experiences with bipolar disorder. And I don't know what that says about my brain, but I couldn't really get that image out of my head for a long time. So now it's one of my favorite images and I put it on my slides. But I just wanted to talk about, we use the word comics again in regular conversation, but if you want to look at a definition of a comic is, again, it's a narrative. It's another type of narrative, except that it's a visual narrative. So pictures arranged in sequence, it's a visual medium, and yeah, so something, comics I understand can be in lots of different formats. So you can have graphic novels which have very, very realistic drawings, but you can also have graphic novels which use kind of cartoon type images. And so, for this particular study, I thought about the cartoon as a building block of a comic, as kind of the fundamental unit of a comic. And if you look at the literature on comics, so Tangles is another beautiful graphic novel. It's about Sarah Levitt's mother's experiences with Alzheimer's. Again, it's incredibly moving. It gives you a sense of what someone with the disorder goes through. And again, helped me understand the disease in a way that I don't think I could have without the illustrations. Anyway, so going back to the literature on comics, so clearly one of the advantages is that through the comics medium you can help your readers see what they otherwise couldn't see. So you can help make visible abstract phenomena. I'm not sure if I have an image of this particular illustration I'm thinking of. So, for example, in Marbles, in which Ellen Forney talks about bipolar disorder, she talks about the symptoms of bipolar disorder, and she talks specifically about the highs of mania and the lows of depression, and she uses the visual metaphor of a carousel to kind of explain what the highs and lows look like. And for someone who hasn't experienced the disorder or doesn't, it's a pretty abstract concept. The image helps you kind of visualize what those highs and lows look like. Comics theorists also say that because of the simplicity of cartoons, comics amplify meaning, because the simplicity of the cartoon image makes you put yourself in the shoes of the protagonist or the person who's telling the story. And that in turn leads to identifications. Again, the simplicity of the illustration makes you identify with the protagonist. So all of the things on this slide, as I was doing the literature review, which all of us love, which is the best part of doing a research study, that was a sarcastic. So as I was looking at the literature review, I realized that comics theorists are saying all of these things, but there isn't a whole lot of empirical research to actually test and see whether comics actually have these effects. So another thing is, comics, help you imagine, because like if you look at some comics artists, you have to complete the story. The entire action is not drawn because the author or the artist expects you to kind of complete the image, because that helps you get involved. So in that way, comics help to provoke your imagination. And as I said, when I was looking at the literature, I couldn't really find a whole lot of studies on the effects of comics on audiences. There were studies on the cognitive effects of comics, particularly with regard to how students whose second language is English, perhaps how do comics help them learn. But then there were sometimes I found discrepant results. There's also, I couldn't find a whole bunch of studies of comics in health and science communication. Again, the results were mixed. And again, the results tended to focus more on, gain in knowledge and maybe not the emotional response. As I was kind of, building towards what I was going to ask in my dissertation, I came up with these three questions. So when you read a graphic novel or when you read a comic book, there are so many different moving parts. There's you as the reader, because you bring your own experiences to that interaction. There's, within the comic format, there's the text of the comic, but there's also the images. And so how do all of those three components interact with each other? Also, I was interested in how do these comics messages, what is the effect of these messages on outcomes other than learning? Because if you think back to the stigma communication model, the stigma messages, yes, they have cognitive effects, but they also have emotional effects, and those in turn lead to behavioral intentions and behaviors. I was really interested in the emotional outcomes. And then, yeah, I wanted to, all the literature on comics theory, all the comics theorists said that, you know, this medium can do what no other medium says it can do. It blows your mind, it provokes imagination, it helps you identify. And I just wanted to see, well, okay, if it does all of these things, can we use it as an anti-stigma appeal or a message? As I said earlier, for this particular, let me just go ahead and, for this particular study, I have friends who, you know, are kind of graphic novel or comics experts, and I must say that I enjoy, my favorite kind of part of comics is non-fiction comics, which is, I don't think that's what it's supposed to be, but that's what I really, that's what I enjoy, because I enjoy non-fiction, and I particularly like non-fiction comics about health, because that's what I study. So I'm making that point to say that, you know, you can have a really simple comic with just, you know, the sequential panel, but you can, I've seen some amazing illustrations where, you know, the image is drawn from the perspective of different characters. But in this study, because it was, I wanted to keep things really simple, and I wanted to operationalize a comic in terms of its most fundamental form, which is cartoons. So, and I wanted to contrast it with something, because I was going to look at news stories and how, like, if I had a news story with, you know, cartoon images, how would audiences respond to that differently from what they are used to seeing? And they are used to seeing photographs. So typically you have a news story and then you have photographs. And also, if you look at a continuum of, you know, concrete to abstract images, photographs kind of fall at the concrete end, and then comics. So the most abstract symbol would be, you know, verbal symbols. So the comics, I mean, the cartoon would kind of fall somewhere in the middle. So I thought of using this particular diagram to kind of operationalize cartoons. And then, yeah, so I did an online experiment. I don't really want to go into the details, except just to say that I can describe the experiment for you. So I did the experiment on a pool of US adults, and I recruited them through this particular platform called MDoc. So it helps you, you know, administer your study to people from all parts of the country. And then also, just to kind of describe what the study looked like, I had I had 6 different conditions. So let me explain it this way, it'll be easier. So let's think of just one of these diseases at a time. Let's think of depression. So I had 3 different groups. One was a control group, and the control group read just a news story, just with text. I had a cartoon group which read that same news story, except that story was now accompanied with cartoons. And then I had a photo group, and then same story again, but now it was accompanied by photographs. And I wanted to not just focus on one mental illness. I wanted to look at another type of mental illness, because mental disorders are so different, and I wanted to see if the effects for one particular disorder are different for another. And I also wanted to look at differences in severity. So depression is perhaps a disorder which, you know, most people understand, they hear about in the news, whereas bipolar disorder is more severe, and maybe it's something which is not as well understood. And so, yeah, so so if I was the subject in the study, I would either read a story read a story that was just in text form about mental illness, or I would read a story that had both text and photos, or I would read a story about text and with text and cartoons. Just to tell you a little bit about the story was about a 700-word feature story. So a feature story is different from kind of a hard news story in the sense that it's a narrative. It tells you about a particular person. And so in this case, the story it wasn't a real story. It was fictitious. It was a story about a young student who was a freshman, had just begun university and had begun to experience symptoms of either depression or bipolar disorder, and then how that person kind of navigated through the healthcare system and where they came out at the end. And so the story was the same in all three conditions, and the text was the same. I just changed the images. I can show you in a second what the images look like. I just also want to tell you what I was measuring. So if you were the subject, after you read the story, you would answer some questions about. So since as I said, I have a journalism background, I'm a student in communication. I was just interested in whether audiences would see the story that had cartoons as less credible, because cartoons are not seen as a form of high-level literature. They are, so I just wanted to see whether that would influence the credibility perception of the story. I definitely wanted to measure identification, which is, I wanted to see whether if you as the reader began to identify with the protagonist of the story after you read it. I also looked at other things like, so stigma, behavioral intentions, as I said, social distance, so after you read the story, would you be willing to, how close would you be willing to interact with someone who has a mental illness? Would you support mental health policy? Would you be willing to share the message with your friends? Would you donate to a mental health organization? So the way that was measured is at the end of the study, I just asked, because I was paying my participants, and I just asked them whether they would be willing to donate a certain amount of what they were being paid to an organization. I didn't actually deduct the amount. I wanted to see whether they would say yes or no. And they were told that at the end, so it's not like I messed with their heads, so I did tell them that. And so this is a very, very simple model. So I was looking to see whether differences in image types, so cartoons, photos versus text, would in turn lead to differences in the level of identification or connectedness, and that in turn would lead to differences in the extent to which people had anti-stigma behavioral intentions or behavior. And so this is an example of a photograph from the story. As I said, the text of the stories, they were fictitious, but they were based on award-winning stories about mental illness, because I wanted the stories to be fictitious, but at the same time I wanted them to be well written. I wanted to have a certain standard. With photographs, because I was manipulating the photographs, I had to kind of create my own images, because I wouldn't have been able to create the manipulation that was necessary for the experiment. And so one advantage of going to journalism school is that sometimes your close friends are amazing photojournalists. And so TJ was very kind, and I had an undergraduate student who volunteered to be a model. And we, so for the photo feature, we took, I would say, 10 to 12 photographs that accompanied the text. And so this is just one example. So one of the symptoms of depression is being curled up in a fetal condition, or being exhausted. And so the photograph was supposed to capture that. And then, as I said earlier, I wanted to contrast the photos with a cartoon. And so what I did was, I had a graphic designer basically create a cartoon from the photograph. And so in order to make sure that the conditions were as similar as possible and to kind of rule out confounding variables, I had the cartoon based on the photograph. So it's everything is kind of the same protagonist. The only thing which is different is the multiple-eyed monster, and the multiple-eyed monster represents depression. And so storytelling tactic, which is used often in comics, is a visual metaphor or personification, and in this case the monster personifies this particular character's depression. So I wanted the images to be as similar as possible, but I wanted to take advantage of the comics medium. And one advantage of the comics medium is that it can help you see what otherwise you wouldn't be able to see, and in this case it's this dark kind of cloud hanging over the protagonist. So Those were images from a story about depression, and then this is an image from a story about bipolar disorder. Do you want to guess what's going on in this picture? Mm-hmm. Yep.
They seem like they're, I don't know if they're fighting or not. They look like verbal fighters.
It looks like verbal fighting. Okay. Yeah.
How it looks like the girl that who's trying to see sort of acting with the girl, maybe just because she looks more aggressive but comes out.
Okay.
It's not a very friendly conversation.
Do you think it's a bit? I was we were hoping to just kind of show, and something else which I should say, in the photo feature you saw a number of photographs. The photographs by themselves told the stories. If you saw the previous photograph and if you saw the text with it, perhaps you'd have a better sense of what this photo is. So the photograph was to kind of show the character's highs and lows. So in this case she's incredibly animated, so whether she's having an argument with her friend, that was kind of the idea. And then again, the cartoon was based on that. And I think perhaps from the cartoon you have a better sense of what the person's emotions are. Yeah.
Isn't that just like a pretty stigmatized idea of what depression is like?
That's a really good point. I'll come to that at the end. Yeah. So for this particular image, the thought bubbles basically talk about, this person has multiple ideas in her head and she's trying to convey them to her friend, but it was supposed to indicate a particular stage in her illness. I think, your point is really interesting, and I think I'm still trying to make sense of my findings, and I think your point might tie into what I'm about to say. So. I went into the study thinking that, based on everything that I read in the comics literature, that people would respond perhaps more to the comics images because they tell you more. There is more information in the bubbles, or there's a better sense of what the person is experiencing. But I found that, for credibility, it didn't. As long as you had some type of image, it didn't really matter. So whether it was a photograph or it was a cartoon, people in the image condition responded better than those in the text condition. But when it came to identification, which is an important kind of mediator in the stigmatizing process, people who saw the photographs tended to identify more with the character than the people who saw the cartoons. People who saw the photographs tended to want to disseminate the image more they share the image more with their friends than those who saw the cartoons. Those who responded better to the photographs identified more with the character, and that led to more support for mental health policy. You see the same thing for connectedness. And so as I said, I ran 2 different conditions for 2 different diseases. And what's interesting, in the bipolar condition, I couldn't really see any significant effects, except that, and I know this is, it's not, we don't have any significant effects, it's really hard to tell a story, but I was looking at the means, I found that people seemed to respond more to the cartoon condition than the photo condition. Fortunately, in addition to having scaled responses, I also included open-ended questions, because I really wanted to get a sense of how the audience was responding to these stories. And so for the people who saw the photograph of the person with depression, they described the images as humanizing, and they felt that they could be in that person's shoes. In the cartoon condition, they said that, so there was in this particular quote, the person is referencing this particular image where the person with depression is it kind of looks smaller than everyone around her. And so again, the person is saying, well, it helped me understand the symptoms of the disorder. But some people, to your point, did feel that the cartoons were childish, they were comical or dull, that they were inappropriate to the seriousness of the issue, they seemed to trivialize the matter, they weren't informative. This person, however, as opposed to what you said, did feel like it removed a little bit of the stigma, but I can see it both ways. So I think again it's important to remember that this is just one study with one story with one set of images, and so it's hard to make a sweeping generalization about all photographs are amazing and all cartoons are terrible or vice versa. So, but that's definitely an important point, that the simplicity of the cartoon or the visual metaphors or the personification sometimes draw on stereotypes, and that could have a negative effect. Something which I didn't really, think about. A lot of people in the bipolar condition did comment on how, pretty or normal or happy the protagonist looked. And then in this case, they thought the cartoons were humanizing, whereas in the depression condition, they thought that the photographs were humanizing. So it does seem that the level of visibility of the illness influences whether what type of image is going to be more powerful. This is a quote from the bipolar condition, and again the first sentence echoes your point about how maybe cartoon is inappropriate for the seriousness of the issue. But again, it helps you understand the story. It tells you the symptoms in a succinct and concise manner. So there is an advantage to that. In terms of, I just want to make sure we have enough time for discussion. So in terms of just wrapping it up, as I said earlier, I'm interested in running more studies in either different disease contexts or different story types, or using different types of images. So the study is limited in so many ways. I looked at, for each condition there was just one type of story. Also the protagonist in the story was young, she was female, there was a particular narrative arc. So if you vary all of those things, you might get different findings. I don't think the study is, and I guess this is a biased perspective, but I think it's useful and important in the sense that it makes you think about the iconography of illness, in the sense that the way you depict an illness influences the way the audience perceives it. Another thing which I didn't mention in this slide, I feel that it's possible that in the depression condition, people responded more to the photographs than to the cartoons, perhaps because they thought the cartoons were childish. But I think another reason could be is that I think because of the level of stigma around mental illness, we still don't really see everyday images of people with mental illness in the news, in a non-stigmatizing context. Typically it's a story about someone who's committed a violent crime, or someone who is either causing danger or in danger. And so I think in this particular story, this was a story about a young college student who could be, who any of us could identify with, who had struggles that any of us could identify with, who had difficulty navigating through the healthcare system, again, which all of us have experienced. And so, and also there was an image, and something else I should say is the participants did not know until the very end of the study that the story was not real, right? So they went into the study thinking that these photographs are real, or this is an actual person. And so it's possible that just not seeing images of people with mental illness itself made them gravitate more towards the photographs. But I think it's important to look at the way you depict a disorder, the way you depict an illness can influence how people respond to it. Also, I think of a comic as a multimedia message. It has text, it has image, and it's helpful to look at the effects of multimedia messages and not messages that either just have text or just have images. And I think, as I said earlier, there's a large body of research, a growing body of research on narrative persuasion. And I feel that the study contributes to the literature because it's looking at narratives again, but then a different format of narratives, sequential narratives or visual narratives, or specifically comics in this context. I think that was my last slide. Yes, okay, one last point. As I said earlier, as as I said, as someone who grew up in a country where people speak multiple different languages, whenever I would go to my GP, I would typically see some kind of cartoon image of how to take your medicine or how to brush your teeth or whatever. And I wonder, and I also, talking about NAMI and other kind of advocacy groups, when I go onto their website, sometimes I will see cartoon images or abstract images kind of representing some symptom of mental illness. And I think, we need to do research and think about whether should we really have an abstract image or should it be better to have an actual person? So I think, the study has implications for either campaign design or patient education or medical education. Okay, clearly I'm not done yet. Okay, this is, I think I alluded to this earlier. Something which I struggled with this study is, for those of you who are huge fans of comics, and the comics medium is so rich in that it's so complex. You can do so much with the medium, and in this particular study, I'm essentially, boiling it down, filtering it down to just a cartoon. I'm kind of reducing it. It's a reductionist approach. I'm reducing it to that, building block of a comic, which is a cartoon. And so, I guess you could say that, well, your stories don't really capture the comics medium, but they do capture a part of the comics medium, which is a cartoon. And with an experimental design, you have to kind of think about variables that could confound your results. And so that's why I wanted to kind of approach the study in this way. Something else, and so I shared just some of the findings with you and not all of the findings, but I did measure participants' personal experiences with mental illness. So style of processing refers to, some of us tend to be more visual learners, some of us tend to be more verbal learners, and I did measure that. Unfortunately, I didn't get reliability with the scale, and so I couldn't use it. A familiarity with comics is, for those of you who've either done a dissertation or want to do one, there's this temptation to answer all of your life's questions with this just one study, and your advisor will finally tell you to get rid of some variables. And so familiarity with comics was one of those variables. I already had a lot, and I was decided to save it for another study, but those are some things which I need to go back to the scale and see why it didn't work, or just maybe go back and look at the data and see how the next study in the sequence can be done. Yes, okay, that is the last slide. Okay, great. I'm happy to take questions.
You answered my question on the familiarity with comics.
Okay, all right, great.
Did you when you were getting into this, were you considering whether or not somebody like me, who basically comics was my primary reading from the time I was like 10 until I was 14, and other people who never really picked up a comic?
Yeah.
Was that thought process there?
I did think about that, which is why I wanted to measure familiarity with comics and see if that had an influence. But just from the open-ended responses, it seemed like, I'm trying to remember what the mean age was. I think the mean age was around 30, but I didn't really get that. So it's possible maybe if I ran the study on a younger audience, maybe that, because I know comics are kind of making a resurgence, the graphic novels are really popular, or you have all of these, I don't, apart from Spider-Man, I'm not really into the medium, like I'm aware of all of these superheroes, but I get what you're saying, so maybe with a different audience it could be very different, yeah. Yeah.
Have you, obviously you just said you're not familiar with them, but do you think there are a lot of comics out there for the general consumption that depict any kind of mental illness?
Yes, in fact, there's this. May I go to the internet? Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay. There's this really beautiful website called Graphic Medicine, and they always do like a book review. So. They actually have a conference every year, and this year's conference is going to be at the Center for Cartoon Studies in Denver. But they give recommendations. So comics reviews, for example, if you want to go to educational comics, Um, there are a whole bunch of educational comics, non-fiction comics, anything essentially to do with medicine. Yeah, so I'm trying to think. In addition to Marvels, I've read Psychiatric Tales, which is about, I'm blacking out on the authors. Thank God for Google. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, Darrell Cunningham. It's a really interesting graphic novel, and it talks about, he was a psychiatric nurse for some time. It talks about his experiences. I'm trying to think. There's also, this is a pretty small book, but it's called Black Dog, and I think it's I think it's an Australian author. Yeah, I have a black dog, and it's another really, it's very basic and simple, but it's another really beautiful book. There's also a book written by a French author, and I read the translation, the English translation, and he essentially talks about he lost his son to suicide, and he talks about his entire journey. It's black and white illustrations, again, incredibly moving. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Have you done any research on the webcomics? Similar or something with webcomics?
Yes, the one which I'm most familiar with has to do with, is it depression? I'm blacking out on the name again. Are you asking because of the nature of the medium, the nature of the web?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know that I personally saw my career working on mental. This is like really fun too. So I'm in a couple of like online communities that discuss like coping mechanisms, especially amongst college students and things like that.
Yeah.
And comics are a very popular way for people with mental illness to, and a lot of people like to draw as well.
Yes.
To communicate, their symptoms or the
Yeah.
way they perceive their illnesses with other people. So
Yes.
it's definitely very popular and very well received, like amongst people that have mental illness
Mhm.
versus like a more political article, because that doesn't necessarily touch on what's going on.
Yeah, but
on a
then,
personal level.
yeah, but to your point, there's also a growing movement of using comics in medical education. So teaching medical students. There's another, I don't remember the name, where medical students as part of their training. I think it's a program out of Penn State, where they actually they can take a comics medicine class, and then they draw their experiences with their patients, and it's supposed to help them empathize or understand the problems of the healthcare system. To your point about web comics,